This is Wretched Radio with Todd Friel.
It's not funny. This is Wretched Radio, story number 1, which, by the way, was written about a day or two after a boy who professed to be a Baptist in Atlanta shot up 3 massage parlors. Headline from Larry's Left-Handed News in Schenectady. I'm sorry, my glasses are smudgy. It's the New York Times. Headline: Atlanta suspect's fixation on sex is familiar thorn for evangelicals. Well, suddenly, the world is interested in sex addiction and pornography. When a professing Baptist kid shoots up some massage parlors, wow, they seem to be interested, don't they? When Brad Onishi heard that the man accused of a rampage at 3 Atlanta area spas told detectives that he had carried out the attacks as a way to eliminate his own temptations, that claim sounded painfully familiar. Dr. Onishi, who grew up in a strict evangelical community in Southern California that emphasized sexual purity. So this story is based on this Dr. Onishi, who, I don't know what he says today about his personal faith, grew up in a Southern California evangelical community. The evangelical culture he was raised in, he said, quote, teaches women to hate their bodies. Did you know that? I think that there's been just such a saturation of sermons on this subject in the books. Lifeway can hardly stock them all that teach women how to hate their bodies. Did you know that that's what was going on? As the source of temptation, and it teaches men to hate their minds, which leads them into lust and sexual immorality. Well, apparently this evangelical kind of forgot about his Bible, and the issue is of the heart. And every individual sin is every individual sin. Was there an era in evangelical history when the purity culture was imbalanced? I think we have to admit, yes, it was. There were stories that were being told. There were people who were on the speaking circuit that would say things that were really unbiblical and really unhelpful. And they could, one suspects, cause somebody to think poorly about themselves, which is true, by the way, of everything. This man's accusation, no substantiation. None whatsoever. You say it, the New York Times prints it, that's reality. Nothing concrete to say because of A, therefore B. Nope, this was just this man's conclusion. And you and I think, could learn a little something about this so that we don't repeat some of the mistakes that took place inside of the purity culture. We need to be teaching a full Christian view of sexuality with our kids. That purity is indeed what God insists on until a man and a woman say, I do. You should be saying, I don't do that until then. But if you do, and you sin, he's faithful and just to forgive us of our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And you will not be a second-class Christian. You will not be an irreparably dirty person for the rest of your days. Your life will not be ruined. God died for sinners, including fornicators. We need to make sure that we don't repeat any of the errors that were committed in the past from the purity culture. Having said that, can we say that this kid basically shot up in 3 massage parlors because he maybe was exposed to that teaching, although, quite honestly, nobody did the research to see if he did. Nobody knows. Did he have a purity ring? Did he follow the Jonas Brothers? Miley Cyrus? Anything? Nope. You say it, and that's the way that it is. And that is what was printed in the New York Times. For some with experience in evangelical youth culture, the shooter's fixation on sexual temptation was a reminder of a damaging approach to teaching young people how to address sexuality. And so the emphasis in New York Times, it's pushing toward, and there's many other articles which I hold in my never-before nicotine-stained fingers, that it was because of the emphasis on purity, he acted out sexually, which ultimately led him to killing 8 people. If you presented this in a court of law where it actually is a law court and not some ridiculous current court where everything is looked at through a CRT lens, you would be laughed out as an attorney. Your Honor, I believe that Helen, she grew up on a farm. And we know that on farms, regularly farmers struggle. Helen acted out like so many farmers who have struggled in the past. I think she's guilty. The judge would say, what farmers are you talking about? How did they act out? And how do you know that that was Helen's motive? Just ridiculous conclusions. And yet, that is the way the case is being made. From the New York Times. Purity culture teaches young men to view young women who do not try to maintain modesty as sinister forces. It's hard not to think about the fact that Asian women have been sexualized and set up to be viewed through the lens of an exotic other who is sexually desirable. All right, so now we've made our claim based on thin air. Purity culture teaches men that women are wicked because of the way they dress. And Asian women somehow now get introduced into this. They've been sexualized and set up to be viewed through the lens of an exotic other who is sexually desirable. And we know that that was what was going on with this kid. We know that this is what's going on in culture. These are absolute, whole cloth, made up, personal musings, but nothing scientific. Now, that does, however, raise an issue that I think is valid, and you may recall it was a few years ago when conversations like this used to be just amusing or good tish rating. We would talk about this at the dinner table, but we didn't think it would get this serious. Do you remember when there were some people who were really not pleased that evangelicals would ever say to women, please think about the way you present yourself. Please think about the way that you dress, because men, they are lusting dogs. Please don't lead them into temptation. And people howled at that. They concluded that anybody who would say such a thing was concluding that women are responsible for the man's sin. We have to make that really clear. They're not. A man's sin is a man's sin. A man can lust after a woman in a burqa or a bikini. It doesn't matter. It's a man's sin. It belongs to him, period. Now, having said that, does that mean that women should not be mindful of that? I think so. Just as you would be mindful about where you take yourself at night. You can walk on a well-lit street or you can walk through a dark alley. Which are you going to choose? Wisdom says, I'm going to walk where it's lit. It's just safer there. Similarly, I think a woman can be wise about how she presents herself, knowing that men are indeed lusting dogs. And if they are presenting their bodies in an unbiblical way, an immodest way, as defined by many other things than how long a skirt is or how tight a blouse is, there are biblical ways to measure modesty. If a woman is stepping outside of those parameters, that's a different issue. Then she could be sinning, and that would be her sin. But it's this intersection, though, of her sin, his sin, and wisdom that a few years ago people were saying, oh, you can't say that about women. You can't tell them that because that makes them the person responsible for the man's atrocious behavior. No, it doesn't. He's responsible for his atrocious behavior, but she's also responsible for her behavior in a different way. Now, that is clearly that any sort of distinction or nuance in that understanding, totally erased, because we have encouraged women to please be mindful of how lusting a man's eyes are? We've taught women to loathe their bodies and men to objectify them. And somehow then Asian women got brought into this because some of the people who were murdered were Asian. That's where we are. We need to be aware that these are the arguments that are being used against Christians. Can we change their mind about these things? I think that there could be some who will listen thoughtfully and carefully. But it seems to me that until people have a serious heart change and are able to think better, I think that this is a trend that can only become more and more extreme, which might infringe more and more on our religious rights and ultimately our persons. This is Wretched Radio.
Hey,
Anytime.
sweetie.
Take her around the block a few times?
Who's a good girl? You're not, because nobody does good. No, not one. Romans 5 says we're born in sin and iniquity, and our hearts are deceitful and wicked. You know that if you'd use the law, which brings about the knowledge of sin.